Thanks for coming today. I'm Kevin Padian. I'm the director of the college writing program and a professor in integrative biology. And so I'm especially pleased to have Tim Ferris on our program here today. I'm going to introduce Steve Tollefson in a second, and he will give Tim a proper introduction, have a nice conversation with him. But I want to say mainly that I've been an admirer of Tim Ferris's books for a long time, and the best indication of that is that I have his books on a shelf, and I went to try to prepare a couple of remarks based on his works, and every one of his books on my shelf was missing. And that's about the best compliment that you can give a writer, because it means that people just can't bring themselves to return them. That's good. So I think that anyone who writes a book called Coming of Age in the Milky Way is a pretty cosmic dude and has a sense, a scope of how science works for people that is really extraordinary, and that's the way Tim's work is. We need that kind of literacy in the world. I was reminded of when I was in college, one of my housemates was a clinical psychology student, a very bright guy, and we were sitting one night looking up at the stars on an especially clear night, and he said, you know, gosh, look how bright it is. We can see the Milky Way. It seems really close. And I said, yeah, and you know what I learned in astronomy class? That we're part of the Milky Way, like our solar system is like right in the Milky Way. And he said, wow, he said, that's the best news I've heard in weeks. I'm going to introduce Steve Tollefson, longtime lecturer in our college writing program, man about campus, and the founder and chief organizer of the Berkeley Writers at Work, to give an introduction to Tim and have a nice conversation with him. Thank you so much for coming. Steve?
And my introduction should be longer than it's going to be. I hope that you've had a chance to look at the press release maybe, or that you're here because you know Timothy Ferris's work. What you need to know is that several of his books have sort of been nominated for some and received most possible awards that are offered to books. I mean, I'm trying to make it clear that I'm intimidated by this today. Coming of Age in the Milky Way was named by the New York Times as one of the best books of the 20th century. You know, not one of the best books of the month, but one of the best books of the 20th century. The whole shebang is one of the best books about science, a lasting contribution to science, nominations for the Pulitzer Prize, the American Institute of Physics Award, endless awards for these books. And I really hope that you will read some of these. I can't actually recommend a single one because I find them all so interesting. But please note that there is a table conveniently in the back of from the campus bookstore of books. And perhaps at the end, something will have piqued your interest in one or the other of these books. In addition to the books, which are fantastic, he's also an award-winning documentarian, and one of his movies, and I believe it's Life Beyond Earth, plays regularly on PBS in prime time, and it has for years. And the movies themselves are marvelous too. So, and I know he's working on a book at the moment, and I hope we'll have a chance to ask him some questions about that. So, would you welcome Timothy Ferris, and he and I will start talking. Yeah. Will you, can you all hear us in the back? Always in this room, there's a, yeah? Okay, you'll tell us if you can't. I have three beginnings, and I couldn't decide which one, so we're going to start this interview 3 times.
One critic of Coming of Age in the Milky Way complained that it started 3 times and ended 5. So
then we're going to be okay. That's sort of like part of the Big Bang Theory, though, isn't it? I mean, the expanding, contracting, never mind. Okay.
Is that one of the beginnings?
When we talked on email recently, you said that you were working on your new book, And I realized that I hear that a lot from friends and probably from myself. Yes, I'm working on my book, and that usually means that we're having coffee at Starbucks. So what I want to know...
Starbucks, I trust.
I was using it just as the generic. So what did you mean? What were you actually doing when you were working on this book? I want like some detail. What were you doing?
Well, I just submitted a manuscript about a month ago now to a book on amateur astronomy and stargazing called Seeing in the Dark. And for some reason, at the end of the prefaces to all my books, we're getting feedback anyway, but I'll try moving even closer.
And I'll move away.
Excuse me. I was in the observatory all night last night, turned into a clear night, and if you're out all night in these high humidity, you get congested. So for some reason, I don't know why, I have always ended these prefaces by saying where and when the book was written. So I went back and looked up when I had started this one, and the answer was 1991. So it turned out I'd spent 10 years on this book. I was surprised to find. So when I talked to you, I was feverishly finishing one last write through to send that manuscript, except for the appendices, off to Alice Mayhew, my editor, and then she, about 2 weeks later, sent it back, and she had one kind of brilliant suggestion for revisions, which, although it was only one suggestion, it impacted on, I think, 15 different sections of the book. So, and I could see she was right, so I did those revisions, and that's what I was doing.
So this is leaping ahead to question 10, but the revisions, both someone else talking to you about revisions and your own revisions. Can you tell us what she said? Would it mean anything to us? And then,
well, it's
and
kind
why
of a
did you like
technical
it?
point. The book's divided in 3 parts. It takes place in the framework of a single night at the observatory. And it's partly an autobiographical book, and it's partly a journalistic book about the revolution that's going on in amateur astronomy. You know, there are people with backyard telescopes now who can do work that only a couple of dozen of the best equipped astronomers on Earth could do half a century ago or even more recently. And some of them are doing things that no one would be doing if it weren't for them. So to me, it's quite interesting sociologically because it's a return to a more of a level playing field in science in which amateurs who care to do have a chance to do some meaningful science and along with the professionals. And there's a third element in the book too, but in between these chapters I have these visits with individuals, mostly stargazers. Some of them are quite casual stargazers. One, for instance, is an English amateur astronomer named Brian May. Does the name Brian May mean anything to anybody here? Yeah, Brian May wrote when he was doing his postgraduate work in astrophysics, specializing in interplanetary dust, his garage band switched front singers because their singer quit, and the new singer had a suggestion they also change the name of the band to Queen, and so Brian's written 33 hit tunes, one of which is We Will Rock You and so forth. I find this kind of fascinating because at the time I was at Rolling Stone those days, and I thought of Queen as kind of a flamboyant arena band. I would not have guessed that not only did they have an astrophysicist, they also had a solid state physicist and I think a chemist or a pre-med chemist or something was in that band. Who would have guessed? So I have these visits with these folks, and I wrote them as kind of New Yorker, quote, intensive New Yorker visits where you barely say much yourself and you let the person say a lot. And Alice's point was that this was bringing the book to a halt, because the problem is that no matter how well you edit a quote, how make it smooth, if it's dropped in the middle of what is basically 12th draft, 10 years of work copy, it doesn't compete. she just suggested that to shrink the quotes somewhat so that they weren't so jarring. And it actually wasn't that much to change in terms of amount. It's just that I was asking the quotes to do certain things that by now you were used to, that the book was going to do for you. You know, books like an ocean liner, in some sense, it should be a smooth, wonderful trip, and you don't necessarily, most passengers don't want to go down 6 decks below the waterline and see the big thundering engines and smell the oil and so on. And if you do that accidentally, your editor, if it's a good editor, will let you know.
Well, I hope that's what we're doing today, though. We're sort of going below deck. And
Yes, that's why this is a trip before down below
so,
academic audience.
10 years and 12 drafts. Is that typical or atypical?
No, they're all different. I never know what one's going to be. One is always, there's a terrible tendency to have sunny optimism on this subject. Because the dynamic, I don't have very good memory anyway, and the dynamic of a book is that, you know, you sign it, your first book contract is the most instructive because you get yourself in this horrible mess, and they didn't give you enough money to have anything like enough time to get out of this mess. So you're broke and desperate, and you're in a room for years after year upon year, 7 years in the case of my first book, which only has 2 doors, you know, and one of them is to somehow finish the book successfully, and the other is failure. It's not the worst thing to fail at writing a book, but it suggests that you'd be better suited for another occupation. So the first one is so painful, or was in my experience, that I sort of promised, you know, that I would never do another one if I could just get it through this somehow. But then when you do, for one thing, it now takes a long time to publish a book. 100 years ago or so, 150 years ago, it took 90 days to publish a book. And books were almost free of typos, and they were better, physically much better produced than they are today. Now they're full of typos, they physically almost fall apart, and it takes about a year to 14 months to get one of them out there. I don't know why. So during that time, you go on to work on other things, and you forget how awful it was doing this book. Then the book comes out, you go out on a promotional tour, and I've never been one of those authors that complains about promotional tours. I find them fairly pleasant. You know, you meet lots of interesting people, and they're all kind of interested in what you're doing, and you know, it's like this. You talk to people who are, you know, at least willing to listen. And they tend to, and you know, by now the book is sort of okay. So even if you like read it, you know, it sounds like writing. And what you forget is that you forget everything that got you to that point. You just start to think, well, how hard could this be? So then you sign another contract.
So I'm thinking that in this audience we have, you know, the complete range available on the Berkeley campus, from freshmen, staff, faculty, some people who are required to be here. I hate to admit it, and a lot of people. I should
withdraw my comment about that.
So this is all leading up to your question about you forget how awful it was, and now I'm thinking of having to go back to my class tomorrow, and they're going to say, well, see, he said it was awful. He said writing was awful.
Oh,
so is writing awful?
In my experience, yeah, it's the hardest thing.
Are there questions from the audience? I don't know what else to do.
I mean, it's the hardest thing I've done, and because, and I've thought about why, and I think it's because it's the purest art form. It's just, you know, white paper and words. There's nothing to fall back on. I can't very well complain that the oboe player didn't know how to cut the reeds, or that the sopranos were all off, or that there's not enough room in the wings for the dancer to enter in a full leap like this. And so, you know, you can do absolutely anything on that piece of paper, anything that's known to art, any emotional, intellectual response, any depth of time and space can be plumbed on just that piece of paper, and so that makes it hard. There's not much place to hide out there on all that white. And I think anyone who takes it seriously, and otherwise, why, I don't think you should do it unless you want to do your best. So it's always very challenging, and it doesn't get any better. The only thing that happens is that as the years go by, you've been there before, so you can vaguely say to yourself, I've been here before, but that's not very comforting. It's not a great place to be. Just to give you one very quick, strange example, the whole shebang I wrote for almost a year. I wrote about 110,000 words on the whole shebang without getting a sentence that I could keep. Every day I would come in, I would read what I wrote the day before, and I would say, it's not bad. It sounds like a writer wrote it. It's not incompetent. It's accurate, and so it's sort of what I had in mind. But it's just really boring. It's just dead, it's just lying there, and I don't know why. And I tried all kinds of things. I tried steaming ahead and writing lots of chapters, and that didn't work. And then I tried polishing the first chapter over and over again. That didn't work. And then one day it started to work, and I do not know why. So that's scary, right? Because you always say, well, yeah, I've been here before, and maybe it's going to be like that.
And so that's completely unhelpful to us that you did not know why.
It is. It's a story that it has no moral at all, except, well, actually it does. It does have a moral, and that is, and I do think this is important, that, and we all who teach writing tell our students this, do not wait for inspiration, and do not worry about the quality of what you wrote on a particular day or at a particular time. Most writing by most writers is not good. But so no one can guarantee you that at the end of a day you will have written anything that's good. I mean, maybe 3 times in a career I've written a paragraph that actually was good at the time. You sort of stop, you expect smoke, sulfuric smells to come out of the computer, because you say, my God, this is actually like 5 consecutive sentences that aren't dreadfully bad. But I can guarantee you, if you don't sit there and write 1,000 words or whatever it is, that you won't get any result, good or bad. So that's the moral.
So now can we start again?
Oh, good.
Okay, so starting again. I just saw someone sent me something from the Chronicle of Higher Education, and the writer Robert Owen Butler, Good Scent from a Strange Mountain, I know some of you know that, is also a teacher in Florida, and he has said that he's going to write his next short story over the next 3 weeks with a webcam focused on the screen of his computer. Okay, this is a long setup for the question for you. And he said, for a writer or an artist, this is a kind of daunting and scary thing to allow all of the mistakes, all of the awkwardness, and all of the false starts to be shown. So the question is, if we had it, I'm going to ask, there's 2 questions. One is, if we focus the webcam on your computer, are we going to see anything revealing? Or are we going to not see anything revealing? What are we going to see? And then the next question is, if we focus the webcam on your room or wherever you write. So I want to hear about where you write. So first of all, on the screen, what are we going to?
Well, I wouldn't mind doing that, because I can't imagine that anyone would ever watch it. So it would be just the same as it is. I mean, no one sees it now. No one would see it then. Yeah, just we've got a half hour before dinner time, honey. Let's tune in. Professor Ferris at the keyboard. When I was first teaching writing, I asked some of my writer friends in New York to give me drafts of something they'd written so that I could have examples for my students that weren't just my own drafts. I used to show students one draft after another, and basically how much you throw away, which is something that it's hard to learn, and it's one of the most valuable lessons in writing is to learn to be a cold-hearted son of a bitch when it comes to reading your stuff the next day, because you just got to look at it for what is actually working there. And to my surprise, hardly anyone sent me any drafts, because they were all embarrassed. They didn't want students for years thereafter looking at draft after draft. But the 2 exceptions were Nora Ephron and Thomas Powers, who Pulitzer Prize winner. They both sent me drafts, and I taught from them for years. It was quite instructive. Now I've lost track of where I was going.
We're looking at your computer screen through a webcam.
Oh, that's no wonder I've lost track. What a concept. Well, For many years, I had trouble concentrating, so you would have seen me involuntarily getting up and I used to find myself standing staring into the open refrigerator with no idea of how I got there. You know? Or to borrow a line of Nora's, there's nothing like a deadline to make you realize how much the refrigerator needs polishing. And you will tend to do anything rather than write. You know, I used to run. For decades, I used to run from it and do all sorts of things, really unconsciously, to escape. But now I'm just so grateful to have time at the keyboard that I don't do anything but write when I'm there, and I'm there for hours on end. But I've become aware of how many pressures there are to how much you're going to be doing other things. You know, today, for instance, I might get an hour's writing done if I'm lucky. So you get after you turn a corner at a certain point, and you're just so glad to be there. So you would see me writing paragraph after paragraph of mostly drivel, from which a few things I might be able to keep and turn into something that was a little better the next go around.
So then also the way you said it, it sounds like it would be difficult for us to tune in at 3 o'clock and necessarily expect you to be there. I mean, for instance, today you say if you don't have things like this, do you have a sort of a internal schedule? I mean, do you get up and
I just write at every possible moment that I can. I stopped teaching here, which I regret to some considerable degree, in order to have more time, because at that time I had 7 books on the ramp, and I realized that if I was going to finish them without also having to live to be 120 years old, I had to eliminate something to buy more time. You know, it's just the other things in life do come along, and I do have a life. I do recommend to career writers that the 2 things that are very important is don't abandon your life to write. You can abandon big swaths of it. You can do like what Michael Hare did, where you're going to basically throw 5 years of constant toil into the hopper to make a book that will really last, and that's a good thing to do. But you don't want to get in the habit of not having a life, and you don't want to lose touch with your physical self. I mean, particularly on books, hard, sustained exercise, physical exercise is important, or your health will break down. Books will kill you if you don't. I'm serious. If you don't counterbalance them with something else.
And so you said that you write all the time. Do you have I assume you have an office at home that you work in, but can you write anywhere, or do you try to work in that office? And if so, do you have it set up in a way that's...
Well, I can write anywhere except on airplanes. Like the sight of those poor bastards with those laptops, you know, row after row doing spreadsheets and so on. I don't do that unless if I can possibly avoid it. But yeah, I can write anywhere. I cannot write in any office building in the state of California now because I smoke cigars and it's illegal for me to do so. So I was evicted from the last office building I had, even though I was the only occupant of this office. And it had a deck, and the doors were open on the deck, and it was fresh air all the time, and I would sit in there and smoke 1 Temple Hall a day and write, but the law evicted me. And around that time, an apartment directly below the one I live in became available, so I just rented that and I used that as an office. And it's worked out quite well because now my kid comes home from school, I'm not somewhere else.
So, but that's interesting to me too. So you feel like you need to go to a place. I mean,
Well, I think if you
right?
can.
Yeah.
I mean, anyone would prefer. No writer chooses, as Nabokov did for one book, to write it on a portable propped on the seat of the only toilet in your little country cottage. I mean, that's you only do that out of necessity. If you can, I think everyone would prefer to have a decent environment. And nonfiction tends to be a little more intensive, perhaps because you acquire so many books. I do have a lot of weight around now from that stuff, and I've always been building bookshelves all my life and culling through books and trying to get rid of them, as best I can. But they're such a bargain. I mean, buying books it's just amazing. I'd gotten a lot of money one year from a book, so as an experiment, I just decided to buy every book I really wanted and not worry about what it cost. You know, and I mean, just so at the end of the year, I looked at how much I'd spent on this spree, and it was $1,600. Right. So buying every book I wanted in a year cost $1,600. I mean, that's like a round trip ticket to London. So the books are amazing values, and consequently, I've landed up with a lot of them.
Well, I wanted to start the third time, but I have to go to books. Preface. Where is something about? In the preface to Coming of Age in the Milky Way, you say, "Thanks to my mother for having taught me to love and live by books." And that's sort of a theme that's come up before when we've talked to writers, and I'm thinking of freshmen in particular who say, "Books, books, books, that's all we ever hear. Isn't there another way?"
No.
And so, for you, and I get the sense in the things that I've read from you, that books are something more than just a handy resource.
Yeah, I'm not snobbish about other media. You know, I've worked in feature films and documentaries and popular music production. I'm still a big pop music fan. And radio, a number of media, but there is nothing like books, and I don't think there's going to be. I'm old enough now to have seen 2 or 3 waves of people predicting the demise of the book, and there are more readers in the world and more books sold every day now than there were when any of those predictions were made, and I think that will continue. Books are just amazing things. I was thanking my mother because when I got interested in astronomy originally, it was through books, and I was about 6, 8, 9 years old in there, and we were broke. We were living in a rural community in Florida, truck farming town. And although we were broke, my mother and father always, we had a practice that once a month they would drive my brother and I to the nearest bookstore, which was a long way away. We had to cross the next county to get to a bookstore. And we were allowed to select one hardcover book. And you know, if you can buy one hardcover book a month, you start to accumulate a pretty decent library as a kid. And I remember it distinctly. And of course, the way you read books like that. And then there was the miracle of the library, of course, and that moment that many of you have had, I think, when the librarian tells you that actually you can take a whole armload of books home if it's really what you want to do. I thought that was flabbergasting. You know, I still do.
Can you remember some of those books you bought?
Yeah, I was put onto astronomy by a book that was given to me by my parents. I have a copy, not the same copy now. It's called A Child's History of the World, written by a New England schoolmaster named V.M. Hillier. And it began with an account of the origin of the Earth. And I was astonished by this because I thought, well, it made me realize that, first of all, this hadn't always been here. You know, walking to school, you'd walk through these cane fields and this deep black loamy soil and the smells that come off as the sun starts to hit it. And you realize all this stuff, there was a time when it wasn't here. This stuff was all out there. And if you want to understand how it got to be like this, you have to learn astronomy. So a lot of the early books I got were astronomy books, and by people like Patrick Moore, who I finally had the pleasure to meet a couple of years ago.
That you're making my life difficult. That leads me to 2 different things. One is, my students were very interested in why you became a writer about what they knew I would screw up and say cosmetology, because we talked about that, and it came up in one of your books, cosmology, rather than an astronomer. How did you end up that way?
Well, I came from a family. My parents were both writers, and a lot of my parents' friends who would come to the house and all when I was growing up were writers. So I had a writer's way of looking at the world, and so I had this early interest in astronomy. I didn't for a long time. I didn't necessarily think that the two would go together, and I wrote about a lot of other things too. But when I started writing books, I particularly concentrated on astronomy because I did know that a book is a long haul and that you don't want your subject to let you down when you get out there in the desert. And I knew this subject wouldn't let me down. So I'm a little surprised I've written so many books about astronomy. I'm going to stop for a while. Having finished this one, I'm sending all the astronomy books up to the observatory. We're just building bookshelves up there. And I'm writing a book on politics.
What you said about the reason you're making my life difficult is I needed to ask two questions unrelated about the same thing. When you said about thinking that all that stuff was somewhere else, there was a line from your movie, which I probably won't be able to find. Just amuse yourselves for a moment while I look for this. It's a line about even that all the gold and silver in the world, from the vaults of Fort Knox to the wedding rings in the local pawn shop, had their start in stars that exploded long ago. It's that kind of line that I think really makes your books different and accessible and interesting. That really struck me because it's something I had never thought about until you. So there's no question here. I just wanted to read that line, unless you have something to say about it.
Well, just that the line about the wedding rings in the local pawn shops is not meant cynically. Is I learned it from this wedding ring. This wedding ring was stolen from me by a guy who took a shot at me and took a ring and a watch and some stuff. And the detective, Armin Pellicetti, now head of homicide for SF, when he came and took the report, he said he thought they would get the watch back because it had a serial number on it, and the guy would pawn it. And I said, what about the wedding ring? Because it means more to me than the watch. And he said, he won't pawn that because the pawnbrokers won't take wedding rings in California. They're flooded in them. But the chances are he'll be wearing it when we pick him up. And Armin picked the guy up 4 days later, and Armin's plainclothes, so he had a black and white come make the arrest and followed him to the precinct. And the guy came out of the back of the black and white, he looked at his hands, no ring, said, where's the ring you stole from Professor Ferris? The guy said, I don't know what you're talking about. So Armin pulled the seat out, and this ring was behind the seat. So that was what was behind the pawnbroker line.
Well, that's thank you, because that's really a great segue to
our section on crime.
To our section on why are you so fascinated by crime? No, in the opening to The Mind's Sky, you discuss Magritte's painting Ceci n'est pas une pipe. And for those of you who don't know the painting, it's just a painting of a pipe, and then he's written below, this is not a pipe. And you have a section on Joe Montana. There's a quote on your sheet, I think, maybe about Joe Montana. You talk a lot about music, talk a lot about art. Your books are filled with quotations from everyone from famous philosophers to pop culture. One of my favorite lines is when you say something about imagine a way to get up to the stars, a stairway to heaven, if you will. So my question is, what does it take to be a writer? You seem to be interested in lots of different things, and they all seem to come into play in books that are not remotely related to those things. So,
well, it's I think it can be an advantage. I mean, writers are different; they don't all feel this way, but it can be an advantage to writing that there's so much you can use. You know, I've often kind of admired the lives led by, say, genre writers who write, I don't know, maybe detectives. I don't read detective fiction myself, but I don't know, detective stories or romances that take place in different parts of the world. You say, like, you know, you go and live in France for a year, and you know, every person you see, every place you go is potential material for your your book just seems like a delightful accoutrement to your profession. And the kind of writing I do isn't exactly like that, but it does allow you to use quite a lot from your reading and from the other arts. Although it's funny because you don't know in advance. I mean, it's always. I don't think, for instance, I've ever quoted Bob Dylan, and I've tried to a number of times. I consider Dylan to be the most influential living artist in any medium, and there are good reasons for that. And he's also an extraordinarily smart and very widely read person. So periodically in books I try to get a Dylan quote in, and they never work because they don't dissociate from the music very well. The Seeing in the Dark, the new book, does have a Dylan quote and then immediately quarrels with it in an endnote. My guess is at the last minute I'll cut it out of the book, preserving my unblemished record in this regard. So I tell my students, I teach them how to read in a professional way, which is to say not just to enjoy a book, and not just to read it in this academic way of trying to imagining yourself writing a review, That's fine, but preferable, in my opinion, is the writer's way of reading it, which is, what is there here that I can rip off? How can I gut this book for stuff that I can use on down the line? Now, I'm not talking about copying anybody. I'm talking about squeezing that book like a lemon and making something out of the juice.
So, whose lemons? No, wrong question.
Have I been squeezing lately?
Have you been squeezing? No, we don't care about your personal life. We really don't want to go there. Whose writing do you admire, and whose writing would you wish you emulated or people would compare you to? Make that into a question.
I didn't ever model myself particularly after writers the way some people have. Some writers will write out a novel that they like, like a Fitzgerald novel or something. A lot of writers have written The Great Gatsby on their typewriter. When you're starting, it's not a bad idea. That Michael Douglas movie had a scene like that. Sort of, there was a kind of confusing element in the plot. I thought, what was that film called?
The Wonder Boys.
No, not Wonder Boys.
Apparently not.
No, the other. Maybe Michael Douglas isn't in it. Yeah, I'm sorry, he isn't in it. The Sean Connery film. Thank you. What's that one?
Finding Forrester.
Finding Forrester. There's a confusing plot turn around the issue of this young man's writing the piece that for which he's accused of plagiarism. But it is a fact that a lot of writers, if you start the discipline, the way I recommend that you start is to impose upon yourself a discipline that you're going to spend a certain amount of time a day trying to write. And make it a realistic amount of time. Maybe it's just 45 minutes. And put it at a realistic time when you can actually get it done. Best thing is to get up 45 minutes early every morning, do it then. Or 3 days a week or something. Make some schedule you can keep to, but keep to it. And only write during that time. You'd be surprised what can happen once you start and what won't happen if you don't start. The problem that then confronts you, I did this when I was a newspaper reporter in New York, started getting up 90 minutes early in the morning. The problem is, well, what am I supposed to write? Even though I was a reporter, I would work on assignment. An editor would send me to cover something, and now here I am. And I would try poems and letters and things. And if you're at a loss, just type up something that you like, because you will physically it helps you to get a feeling of it. But I didn't do that to the extent of emulating any particular writer. I was a little bit liberated by a writer, perhaps not so much remembered now, New Yorker writer named Donald Barthelme, because he had a kind of cut and paste organization. I was having a lot of organizational problems. And so liberated by the idea that you could do anything, I wrote some really almost incoherent pieces. If anyone ever, God help me, goes back and looks at like the first piece I ever published first freelance piece I ever published was in Rolling Stone, and it's virtually impossible to tell what the hell this piece is saying. But in terms of voice. It's just this kind of a fireworks show of different voices, and some of that had come from Barthelme. I've lost track of your question. We'll have to start again.
Good. So what?
Oh, which writers? It's
Well, what? So not so much what who you want to emulate. Who do you like?
Well, I read Homer every day, and I love to hear Shakespeare, but I don't like reading Shakespeare so much. I like to hear Shakespeare performed. I read Proust almost every day.
You're making us all very tired. Just
I don't know why.
And making us feel sort of idiotic.
Oh man, I mean, if you come on, Proust.
I've read the same sentence of Proust every day most of my life.
Well, you don't have to. It's not like you have to burn through Proust. It's nobody's watching. Just read as much as it means something to you. But I'm a slow reader. I don't. It's not like I'm no phenom when it comes to reading. But I do. I love those writers, and there's some contemporary writers that I read, and I just did this anthology called Best American Science Writing 2001, and I was cheered in putting that book together, because when you start you always wonder, is there going to be enough to make a first-rate book? And actually there was plenty. I mean, there is a lot of good science writing. I think there are more good writers becoming interested in science, and that's great, because it's a terrific subject.
Do you have secret trash reading habits?
Disappointingly, I don't. I do watch. My sort of equivalent of trash reading is, I'll just make a tall drink and stare at a movie on TV, for an hour and a half, and sort of slack-jawed. Particularly when you're finishing a book, because I find it hard to read if I'm really working that hard on a book, because you get so burned out on words. No, I've always wished I had a good answer to that. But it's no. David Lodge is about as light as I get.
Well, I didn't really expect that from a guy who reads Homer and Proust every morning, but that's...
Well, I didn't say every morning. I said every day.
Every day.
In the morning I read the newspaper.
So, what do you expect from... in the preface, again, I think, to Coming of Age, you talk about how you really have a general audience in mind in these books. That is those of us who are here, and these are not books for scientists. They're for other people, and there's a moral component that I'd like to talk about in a few minutes. But then in the books you have these references again to the Magritte, but you quote from The Tempest and you quote from Brecht's Galileo, and so what sort of background knowledge are you envisioning your audience to have? Are we supposed to get, how much are we supposed to get? Or think of me, your typical idiot reader. How much,
Yeah.
How much am I supposed to, what are you aiming for here?
I'm not. I don't know much about the audience. I'm just trying to write a book that I can put my name on, and it's like making furniture. It's you want to make a nice table, and you might think in a general way. I mean, sort of vaguely, like this is a dining room table, and it's 12 feet long, so it envisions a dining room. Something fairly commodious. It's not going to be in a New York apartment probably. But that's about as much as you know. And to spend a lot of time thinking about who's going to have dinner at this table and what are they like and what kind of finish would they prefer, I think you start chasing your own tail. The question is, what kind of finish works? And if you thought that the natural mahogany was really going to work and you had your hopes set on it, and now the thing's got natural mahogany on it and it doesn't look right to you, you got to strip it and start over. That's your responsibility, and you hope that some audience will respond to that. But I've never known how to do much more than go much further than that, because I don't know how to anticipate their needs, and I'm not sure it'd be a good thing to do.
Do you feel like, what is it you're writing? Do you think that you're writing literature, or do you think that you're writing journalism? Do you think that you're writing science?
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with the term journalism, but of course it means daily. So if you're writing a book, I suppose it isn't technically really journalism, since it's not responding to the day's events for tomorrow's audience. I try to get my students to think in terms of literary values. I don't know whether one attains literature or makes much sense to, to get highfalutin about it, but what are the qualities of literature? It's that they have lasting value to people, and they have lasting value to more than one generation of people. They stay around for a while. People keep reading them. So when my first book is being republished again this year, and that means a lot to me, because a book published in 1977 is still being published and read. Then that suggests that it may have something in it that has value of more than the moment. And I don't think that science books are condemned to have some kind of short reader attention span. There's a lot of popular wisdom about science, as with other fields, that is wrong. And one of them is this idea, usually ascribed also wrongly to Thomas Kuhn, that it doesn't much matter what whatever you write about science now, it'll all be obsolete in 10 or 20 or 30 years, because some revolution will come along and it'll change all this. And as Steven Weinberg points out, if you ask the question, how many well-established findings of, say, physics in the entire 20th century were overthrown by one of these Kuhnian revolutions? The answer is 0. So if you write a superficial book about science, it'll have a short shelf life, just as will a superficial book about anything else. But there's nothing about science as a subject that dooms your book to a fast, quick readership, and then onto the remainder tables.
In one of the books, when you're talking about the Big Bang Theory, you say that it is sort of general enough and comprehensive enough at the same time, so that in 50 or 100 years, you expect that people will still be working around aspects of it. And my students had a very interesting question. They said, how can people be so presumptuous? This is more a science question. How can people be so presumptuous as to think that they know as much as they claim to know about the origins of the universe?
Well, they don't claim to know very much about the origin. I thought there was going to be, how can you be so presumptuous as to say that?
Well, okay, we can do that.
They'll still be listening to the Big Bang Theory in 50 years. One way to keep a science book from going out of date is it's like being a critic, it's 30 years ago, I could have told you pretty accurately which rock songs on the top 30 list were still going to have an audience today, because I was a reasonably good critic at that. And if you can do that with science, then you won't make these mistakes. It's just a matter of doing your homework. So it's on that basis that I say that the Big Bang Theory is like Darwin. But as to why can scientists do this, I don't think that many people in this culture yet have any idea at all what science is, or what it does, or what it has done to this world. I think the world situation that we're in today has a lot of clarity could be brought to that view if people understood better what the scientific revolution of 400 years ago did. But they don't. A lot of people here at Berkeley do, and this audience do, but the culture as a whole doesn't. Perhaps because, as Whitehead put it, it takes about 1,000 years for a genuinely new idea to make it to the mainstream of a culture, and we've only had about 400 years for this one. And for all this talk about how we have rapid communication and everything, it takes about the same amount of time for big ideas to move as they always have. So one of the things that's misunderstood about science is that it's a kind of priesthood in which these authorities hand down these dictums, and how could they be so presumptuous as to make these declarations? And it's not like that at all. It's exactly the opposite of that. And the conclusions about the beginnings of the universe are very modest in nature. They're limited to certain kinds of particle physics interactions. and some certain very interesting and reasoned conjectures which help to change the framework within which one thinks about these things. You know, the origin of the universe was unthinkable 100 years ago. Now there are some tools with which you can start to think about it, talk about it.
You sort of implied what I want to talk about next, and that's what I call the moral component. That's probably the wrong word, but the moral component of your work. In the Chronicle of Higher Ed, April 4th, 1997, the risks and rewards of popularizing science. There are two things you said. First, I think we really should be doing more to encourage scientists to try their hand at communicating to general audiences. And then later, but popularization also produces benefits for the scientists themselves, including heightened clarity of thought about one's own specialty. It aids any thinker in understanding what he or she is doing to describe it from time to time in ordinary language. I'm thinking here of the physicist Ernest Rutherford's admonition that a theory you can't explain to a bartender is probably no damn good. But this whole article was about the necessity of having those of us in an audience like this understand science, and that's what I mean by the moral component. That's something that seems to run through all of your work, that you really feel strongly that people need to be able to separate science from fantasy or from superstition.
I think the world would be a much better place if 10 times as many people understood science as do now, or 100 times as many. And I think that science has a demonstrably beneficial effect on the world in ways, and this is the subject of the next book. The reason I say I'm writing a political book is that it's a book called Science and Liberty, and it's about the political impact of the scientific revolution, because I don't think this has been understood. But that piece was written as a defense of Carl Sagan's career shortly after Carl's death, against the charges of those folks, and some of them had been craven enough to not say anything until he was safely dead, which occasioned the publishing of this piece. Just as Francis Ford Coppola, the great American director, chose the day of Carl's burial to file a lawsuit claiming that he'd been waiting all these years to tell the world that he had actually composed half of the film Contact. It was in response to these folks suddenly finding a voice that somehow eluded them when Carl was around to defend himself that I wrote this piece. And the moral component there had to do with the difference between standing up for things and doing something about it, and just kind of standing on the sideline and snidely sniping. And I've been in academic life for 30 years, but one objection I do have about a number of my academic colleagues is that an awful lot of them do not assume the moral burden that I believe comes with the privilege that is bestowed upon them in this society. They seem to think that they kind of won the Olympics or something because they got a doctorate and got a tenured position, and then now it's just their job to make kind of arch, meaningless references to one another's work for all the rest of time. We as a culture could use the contribution of these smart people in real areas. And it doesn't require that they give up their research. It just requires that they devote a little time to what's going on with real people in the real world, and science is only part of that.
You know, I've done 3 pages out of 12 of questions, so I'm going to ask for a few quick ones. Chapter titles, book titles. The question is going to be how important are these and how much do you think about them. Some of the chapter titles are things that go bump, Being There, and then of course Coming of Age in the Milky Way. I think of Margaret Mead, Coming of Age in wherever, Samoa. The Persistence of Memory, Salvador Dali. Rumors of Perfection. I don't know if that comes from Ella Leflin, Rumors of Peace, and then The Quantum and Its Discontents from Freud. So, how important do you think chapter titles, book titles are, and what do you want them to do?
Well, chapter titles are great, because as long as you're sitting there trying to think of the title, you don't have to write the chapter. And that's why I always have 2 quotations at the beginning of every chapter, because then that's another delay that you can go find a couple of quotations. Book titles are a great comfort, because writing a book's a kind of lonely journey. The way I write anyway, I can't show pages to anyone. It's not like I can ask my wife, what do you think? Because for 98% of the time, as I've been indicating, I know it's not good enough. So why show it to someone else? Have them tell you it's not good enough. So you find yourself clinging to certain sort of talismans, perhaps. And one of them is what I call the wonderful thing. Particularly on a long project like a book. I'm sorry, they've sort of seated me with my back to you folks over here, but though it'll often happen that you'll have something that you like in a piece of writing, particularly a long piece like a book. But one case it was just a magazine article that I kept working on for 14 months, so I was kind of tormented by this process. Couldn't get it right. So it'd be like in the shower in the morning, you think, I've got to go to work. Same thing I've been working on for X amount of time. What if I'm just kidding myself? What if there really isn't a book here, or this article, I just ought to abandon it. It's on the 11th draft and it isn't any good. You get despairing. But then you think, but no, there's this wonderful thing in it. There's the paragraph about such and such, or there's the tremendous descriptive half chapter, in which such and such happens. And that will sustain you for months or years, the wonderful thing. The hard rule of writing is that in the end, you'll have to throw away the wonderful thing. It'll have done its job, and you'll sort of know when you're finished with the book when you cut it. If you don't cut it, someone else will. Your editor will come back, and then they'll... my line editor, Sarah Lippincott, semi-retired, many years in New Yorker, a very good editor. And it's like walking through a minefield to read her manuscript, and I've just had one come back from a couple of months ago on this new book. Because you read on for page after page, there's hardly anything on it, and there'll just be these little occasional neat note, and it'll say, querulous used here and also page 117, intentional, ? Just these little kind of things. And then you'll suddenly turn a page, and it's like you stepped on a mine. There'll be these 2.5 pages, will just be X'd out. Occasionally with a remark, this must go. So, the wonderful thing will get one of those if you don't do it yourself. And the other is a title. I mean, if you do have a good title, then at least you can cling to that.
Where have some of these, I know you can't generalize, but where do some of these titles come of the books in the process?
They just seem, whenever they do, it's often at idle times. And
so you may be well along on a book before the title.
Yeah, it's better, of course, if you can get a title early, but you never know. I've never quite got jammed to the end. I have some movie maker friends who sometimes get stuck. Michael Mann, for instance, seldom has titles while he's making the films, and that produces a dangerous period toward the end. I know that Larry Parks, before he became head of DreamWorks, when Larry was an independent filmmaker, he and his wife had a film where, I forget which one it was, but they just did not have a title. And at a certain point, the studio, when the yellow lights turn to red, the studio sends you a list of cleared titles. And it's about this thick, and it's alphabetized. Try reading through something like that. It's darkness at night, darkness at noon, darkness in Islamabad, dark as, I've never quite gotten into that situation.
So you didn't have Milky Way sort of there, and then you had 40 different phrases.
No, the hard part is subtitles. I've never liked subtitles, and publishers are now very... when you get more commercial, I mean, if it's I make my living writing, so it's a certain part of it's a business. And when it gets down to business, publishers are quite insistent about certain things, and one of them is subtitles. A wonderful title without a subtitle, they get really itchy about and antsy about. And if you refuse to subtitle it, that's okay with them, but they'll say, they'll be nice about it, but to one another they'll say, this guy doesn't really have the killer instinct here, and they'll cut your ad promo budget in half.
This is like this is probably apocryphal, but the study that was done that showed that graduate student papers, if they had a colon in the title, always got half a grade higher because they had a subtitle.
Well, academic writing is they love these split level titles. You know, the meaningless title followed by the subtitle that tells you what it's about. I don't mean meaningless, but I mean it's a title that you can't tell. And you could accuse me of that. I mean, what's Seeing in the Dark mean? Which is the publisher's point. You know, it's a nice title, but if you go into the bookstore and you don't know that this book's about stargazing and amateur astronomy and so forth, maybe you'll never find out. So now I have a subtitle that's like 65 words
Well,
long.
and now they'll have 150 people who know, so when they go to the bookstore, they'll know.
Yeah, that's why you don't want the ad promo budget cut out.
So I have several questions about style, and I'd actually like to start with one about the evolution of your style. I think I see evolution in your style. You may not. So, okay. Carl Sagan in the intro to The Red Limit, that's 1977. Is that the one that's being reissued? So, one of the things he said was its strength was that it was studded with metaphors and similes of poetic clarity, which I agree with, except I read that book after I had read some of your later books, and I think they are much more filled with metaphors and images, the later books, than even that one. But that's just my perception. And do you feel like you've become more comfortable, or you find those things work better, or is this just completely off base?
I just don't know. I mean, I don't know, because I'm hardly going to go back and read The Red Limit. I did revise it once years later, so I did read it then. I don't know. It's an interesting point, but I don't have any way of...
Do you have any sense, other than those of evolution of your style or changes in your style?
No, except I just hope it isn't getting worse. I do sometimes wonder because, well, I don't know why I wonder, but I think it's just another form of insecurity that you always wonder what's happening to your style. But I don't know if, I think it was in David Lodge's Changing Places, back when computers were still a novelty, that he had a character who was an angry young man in England who had been a popular writer when in his 20s and 30s, and now he was kind of an angry, not so young man, and he wasn't read so much anymore, and things were getting tough. And he makes a visit to a red brick university up north for a literary conference and meets a professor who has programmed a computer in the English department to do a concordance of all his novels. And they present him with a printout of this concordance to take home with him. And they inform him that their computer program has determined that his favorite word, after you get past the words everyone uses, is greasy. And having received this information, he never writes another book.
I want to read a couple of your passages, and I hope I don't screw them up too badly. Beyond Virgo lie the Perseus, Coma, and Hercules clusters, and beyond them so many more clusters and superclusters of galaxies that it takes volumes just to catalog them. There is structure even on these enormous scales. The superclusters appear to be arrayed into gigantic cosmic domains that resemble the cells of a sponge. Beyond that, light from faraway galaxies, riding the contours of curved space, becomes as dappled as the moon's reflection on a pond in a gentle breeze. Out there, awaiting some future Hubble or Herschel, lie many a tale of things past or passing or to come. That's from Coming of Age in the Milky Way, and here's one from The Whole Shebang. The observations reveal the galactic center to be an exquisitely complex environment, exotic as a tropical coral reef. Its centerpiece is a chalice-like congress of rapidly orbiting stars, a pair of jets about 4 light years long, a stable ring of orbiting gas clouds, and another ring rushing outward with an array of lacy arcs and threads standing 70 light years tall. So much of these, all of the books, seems like it begs to be read out loud.
I do read them all out loud. I tape them all.
Why?
Well, because I think that's what writing is. I mean, the writing is just a codified form of spoken literature. Literature was spoken long before anyone wrote it down. And when it became possible to write it down, there were some doubts about whether this was a good thing, because they said this will allow people to, instead of really having knowledge, it'll allow them to become puffed up with the semblance of knowledge, when all they've actually done is just read these things instead of having incorporated them. I mean, there are exceptions. Steve Weinberg, the physicist and a writer who I mentioned earlier, Steve can recite hundreds, if not thousands, of lines of Shakespeare. There are people who embody the stuff and speak it. But to me, when writing, all you're doing is writing down what's being said by an internal voice, and you'll find that if you're doing that, you'll find it in your typos. When you make mistakes, there are mistakes in translating auditory words into type. So your brain was sort of signaling you what you're doing, and it has a breathing pattern and so forth. It's like that. So I always kind of enjoy the audiobook stage of it, because it gives you a chance to see whether it does, read okay. Because I think it should, if it's written right, it should breathe right.
We're clearly not going to be able to leave time for questions unless I wrap up, and I know other people get to ask them too. So let me ask too. If you couldn't write about cosmology, about science, what would you write about? You're doing the book on politics.
Yeah, I'm doing the book on
what else would you
liberty.
write about?
Oh, I mean, there are a lot of great subjects. I would love to write some history. There are a number of things in the arts that I think would be rewarding to write about.
And if you couldn't write, if you had no talent as a writer, what would you do?
Music. Yeah, I don't know if I have enough talent, but my son's turning out to have a lot of musical talent, so that's gratifying. Because of my interest in the field, I've spent a fair amount of time with people that have more musical talent in their little finger than I have my whole body, but I still do like music.
This is probably a low point to end on, but I've been waiting for this. I have one more quote that doesn't appear in your little handout because I was afraid that he might see it before we began.
It sounds dangerous. I was afraid when you read The Dappled Pond, I was afraid it was the same metaphor was going to turn out to be in the second book, too. I've always thought that's going to happen sooner or later.
Well, I doubt if you've ever repeated the quote that I'm
okay.
going to read. This is from 1974, and I'm not sure I have a question, but if you think of a question to go along with this quote. Impressive are Raquel Welch's big eyes, strong teeth, tumble of red curls, her broad shoulders and soft breasts, high waist and good legs, her balancing act sex queen vulnerability. She wears too much eye makeup and seems never to make a move, not even to knock the ash off her cigarette, without thinking about it first. The sexual undercurrent between us is zero. So my real question that I've waited all day to ask is, what was it like to interview Raquel Welch?
It was one of the longest interviews I've done. I think, if I remember correctly, we did 3 days of interviews, and then she wrote me some letters to clarify points too, which were interesting letters. I've always had an interest in fashion and glamour, and I mean, it's easy to say women, but I've always had an interest in sort of, movie star. My godmother was a movie star. I always, just sort of that side of life has interested me. And Raquel was such a sort of distilled essence of one kind of that. I forget why we did that story, but it was widely read. It's a good subject. I mean, another thing to say in terms of starting out as a writer is a subject. There are a lot of good subjects you can write about. You don't have to go after the same subjects other people have. And there's an advantage to, one of the things I learned a lot about long form writing from writing about rock music and pop culture, because the targets weren't moving. Rock band generally wanted me to write about them. They would kind of be there at the hotel, and I would show up, and so I could concentrate on the formal aspects of it. And so even though the subjects seemed trivial, I wrote 2 feature-length pieces about a relatively, you'd think, uninteresting band called the Grand Funk Railroad, which are both comic pieces, and I would say actually are fairly successful as comedy writing. So I, there are a lot of subjects.
And I had questions about the humor that you use, but we do have to leave time. I love the little pieces of humor that you throw in, something about Ronald Reagan's presidency, something about whole faculties of social scientists could be thrown into a black hole and we would never hear from them again. I always wonder why you say those things. So
I've thrown a lot of different kinds of things and people into black holes over the years.
So convenient to write about this. Can we throw it open to the audience? And we'll try to remember to repeat your questions so that we can hear. I'm sorry we've gone on so long, but.
Hi. I was wondering, when you're changing subject gears, like from cosmology to politics, do you feel intimidated?
Really hard, and I think could everyone hear the question?
Can we just
Yeah.
repeat it, because I don't
Go
think
ahead.
it probably picked up on the mic. I think you all could hear it. And that is, how do you feel intimidated by the depth of knowledge when you're onto a new subject? Is that a quick enough summary?
How
Yeah.
do you get over it?
Yeah, I do, and particularly at my age, I start to worry about, can I do this again? Can I really learn some new thing? Maybe I'm just getting too dumb now, or too whatever. And it's hard. It's a lot of homework, and one little trick that I think is helpful. I mean, there's no substitute for reading and doing the research. You should have something like 10, 20, 30, 40 times as much stuff as you're ever going to use in your writing, and that's how you develop some assurance. But there's also a sociology in each field, and you need to learn essentially who the cast of characters is and who are the heroes and villains and how they relate to one another, because until you know that, you won't be able to interpret what they say really about their own field. And there's always a certain point in, this is kind of the journalistic side of it, I would say, that when you've learned that enough, you've learned the sociology enough, that you can now start understanding what people are saying to you. And I don't interview people to learn the facts about a field, but I do need to understand that interplay, perhaps, and so that follows the research. I mean, in politics, for instance, just to give you a concrete example, P.J. O'Rourke is on a book tour right now. He'll be in San Francisco in a couple of weeks. Old friend of mine, probably not politically in the same camp with many of you in this room. However, P.J. defines himself politically as a liberal, and he knows what he's talking about. If you don't understand why he says that, what he means by that, then you haven't learned the field, right? And so you want to learn, you need to learn it on that level for starters, just to use the vocabulary.
Thank you.
Other questions? Well, I'm not going to sit around staring at all of you till you
Here's
cough
one
one
over
up.
here,
Up
yeah.
behind? Yes. And just for the mic, do you have any advice for former scientists who want to be authors on where to get published, how to get started?
I would try to find some outlet that will A, publish you, and B, provide halfway decent editing. Because that way the main thing is to keep writing steadily and to publish somewhere. Because writing that just grows in a drawer, I think, is in the long run not. Many students, think that there's such a thing as the pure writer whose works all go in a drawer and aren't discovered until after his death. That almost never has happened. Almost every writer we have ever heard of was well known at the time that he or she was alive and published prolifically. So there is something different about publishing that helps, and it helps people get back to you about it. And I wouldn't worry about funding initially. I would just worry about trying to get a lot of words through your fingers that way. Preferably something like 1 million words. Starting writing is to me writing is much more physical than it is intellectual. And so if a student writes a couple of good things and says, well, do you think I have what it takes to be a success as a writer? It's like saying, I won a couple of bronzes in the 400-meter dash. Do you think I have what it takes to be a marathon winner? The answer is it takes 2 years of work between here and answering that question. Tell me what your marathon times look like in 2 years, and then we'll know the answer to that. And it takes somewhere between 100,000 and 1 million words to get yourself physically up to the point that you have a shot at, doing this full time if that's what you want to do. Same as in any. I think it's closer to a sport than it is, an intellectual thing. The same as any sport, right? What counts is how much time have you got out there, and what kind of results have you gotten once you've figured out which end was up.
Free time to get away from writing.
I like sports. I like things that are, sailing or windsurfing or stuff that's tennis stuff is, outdoors, and it gets a lot of dopamine going. I mean, good, hard, physical stuff, I played touch football for years until I finally just got all torn up and couldn't do it anymore. I travel, I go places and don't work for a while, or I'll take 10 days off and do nothing but run and surf and play golf. Just something that's really different from writing.
How would you teach writing if you were a writing teacher? And you have been.
Yeah, I've taught writing at 4 universities, and it's a complicated answer. I mean, it's big files full of the answer to that, but it's more like coaching, than anything else. It's like coaching a sport. You find there's a range of talent, and at the upper end of that range of talent, there's someone who might have a shot at doing more with it. But all through the range, there are people who can enjoy themselves, have a better life, have more rewards from doing it, and try to help everybody with it. A lot of what we do in teaching writing is undoing bad habits that previous teachers have instilled. Kids start out talking kind of wonderfully. They want to say the sun is shining, they say the sun is shining. But teachers necessarily have to teach them how to use more words and everything, and in the process, a lot of the teachers don't write, and they get. I just had an argument about this with a teacher at my son's school in San Francisco. They keep giving assignments to the students to write about their feelings. They've all written scores of papers about their feelings about the event of September 11th, but they're taught so little about the facts that my son comes home and asks me, what was in the news today? I feel so ignorant, because they don't teach us anything about what's going on in the world. They're living in the middle of this huge civics exercise. And what I said to this teacher who didn't appreciate it very much was, real writers don't do that. We don't write pieces expressing our feelings, because there isn't any market for it. What we write are pieces that evoke a feeling in the reader. And presumably we had some emotion, or we couldn't evoke that emotion, but try writing a piece that's all about how you feel about things, see who reads it. Yeah, gee, I'm all broken up about these events, and I want to take a few minutes of your time and tell you just how bad I feel.
We need to end, and that's too good. I think we should end there. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I hope you'll be able to stay around for a few minutes.
Sure.
People have